What I think I might do is ask a direct question of each of you based on your presentation. And if someone else really wants to pipe in after, feel free, but probably have to go kind of rapidly between you. I'll start with Daniel and Brendan. I think there was a lot of focus on older strips in the city today, kind of pre-war, pre-car retail strips. You guys are out in the post-car, post-war, pre-car, whatever. You guys are in the suburbs. And do you find it different working out there than your work downtown? And I bring this up because we hear a lot about, politically anyway, the tension between downtown and the suburbs, and it's been used as a wedge issue by a number of politicians. But are the values more similar than not?
Yeah, may I speak to that? Yeah, so it's interesting because the BIA we're working with, Michael Thompson was part of Rob Ford's crew, and I stay away from explicit political conversations because our views are quite different. But it's interesting working with the folks in the BIA specifically. But there's kind of a shared vision of a vibrant, well-lived, well-loved neighborhood that is populated by small business owners that take care. And so it's also interesting to see as I alluded to in the presentation, this intersection of city building goals and small business goals. And I think I interviewed an urban planner who approached the Wexford Plaza 10 years ago and with a similar proposal, and she was kind of laughed out of the meeting room. And something's changed in the last 10 years, and I think people kind of understand that creating a vibrant public realm is part of good for everybody, and that goes beyond this downtown suburbs notion. Everybody wants a nice place to live. Do you have anything to say to that?
No, you covered that. Cool.
Do you find that there's an appreciation for the suburbs the way I think a lot of us who are urbanists think they're these neat spaces, a little bit retro, a lot of potential. In your work with the community, do the people who use it every day appreciate them, or do they think they're ugly? Do they,
I think there's this idea that they could be improved on, but I think people are attracted to the ways of life that they've forged there, and they're happy with it. And, part of Plaza Pops, we're taking over 10 parking spots, but there's still going to be parking. And so it's growing with the habits and pride and life ways that exist there already.
I don't know if you have another question, but or we could.
Well, I'll ask one of Ellen now. You talked about finding meaning and placemaking, and the greatest places that you might think of as places seem organic, but we also have to go through this process of finding meaning, pulling out that meaning of place. But meaning is so subjective to each one of us. A strip of sidewalk that means nothing to me means the world to someone else. So how do you find those common bits that connect to all of us?
Yeah, I think one challenge with the intangible is that we all have, memories and nostalgia about places. But I think when we're talking about it in a framework of heritage planning or identifying meaning, value, and significance, it's where, as a community, we have similar values and similar attitudes towards a place. So it is about more than just, I like this place, you like something else, and it's not, I don't think, just necessarily everybody's opinion, but it is really a collective understanding of a place. And so this is a challenge for us in what is community. Is the community a geographic group of people? Is it the people who come to the public open houses? Or is it people who share, live in the same geographic area? Or what are the multiple communities that are there? And how do we create the techniques for drawing out from people what the commonalities are? And I think I'm interested in doing that. I don't have an answer to how to do it. There's techniques that are used, things like Julian talked about, like mind mapping or making mental maps of places. But I think going to where people are and the places that people are using is important, rather than making people go to another place for a public meeting to talk about why some other place is important. So, work in progress, but.
Well, one thing in the relatively recent past that kind of surprised me was maybe around 2011 when the Ford brothers were attacking the libraries in Toronto, and there was this huge kind of it felt very grassroots across the city, downtown and suburb, of people kind of defending the library. It was like the libraries were a community space that meant a lot, and that was really interesting to me to see that kind of connect, across these kind of artificial boundaries that we've put up.
Right.
That was like that was,
Oh, okay. All I can say is I love libraries. My local library growing up was in a strip mall, and so they have the best. It's still there, actually. They're fantastic structures. So yay for libraries and the Toronto library system.
I just want to build on that really quickly, because I think this gets into the idea of social infrastructure and how important, as libraries as a great example, and how important that is to the fabric of our culture and how we, as communities, engage in the process of change. And so I think a lot of, across all of these projects throughout the day, we've been talking so much about how important the role of the community voice and a diversity of voices in any community, how important that role is in the process of contemplating projects or managing how things move forward. And I think our project is largely about trying to create more social infrastructure, more place, whether it's not a library, in our case it's more just a public realm, a higher quality public realm, where those shared values can be developed through conversation, and people can essentially develop capacity to cooperate and work together. And that's one of the most important things, I think, just generally speaking, and I think it's come up with other speakers. I think that's another way of what Robert was saying earlier as well.
Thank you. I want to add to that, because I don't know what kind of question you could ever think of to ask me about the avenues, Shawn, so I'm going to jump in. And
easy for
I'm sure you would have thought. Anyways. But I think the idea of community is interesting, because there's also the people who don't live there yet. So when there's a new development, or I actually think the avenues is about non-gentrification of neighborhoods, and it actually allows a whole new group of 10,000 people to live in a downtown neighborhood, and they don't live there yet. So when you're talking about an open house to see who wants to have that happen, well, guess what? What's going to happen at the meeting. And I think it's really important that we understand when we're building the city, obviously community is absolutely critical and important, but there's also a contingency of people who don't know that it exists yet, and they aren't there. The friends of that thing don't exist yet. So I think that's another side of the community idea, and experiencing places and trying to maintain things that are important. That's why we were kind of developing the avenues as an idea that perhaps that is an area of the city that could be supplanted in a way to bring new housing down to the center of the city.
That was kind of close to my question that I was going to ask you, because in your so thank you. In your charitable architectural practice, thank you for your service. You're going to be kind of you're speaking for these people who have not yet come here, and we see resistance to new people all the time in neighborhoods across the city and beyond Toronto. How have you and your students kind of forecasted to how you're going to convince a city that people kind of go to war against, putting in a stacked townhouse in a neighborhood? How are you going to politically get?
No, we haven't solved that yet. No. I was going to ask Kristyn that question. No, but I think, obviously, what I think is important, though, that we've started with the idea of architectural form. We haven't started with looking at the setback model and say, how are we going to squeeze that one in here? We've actually looked at a new architectural built type form and said, now we've developed something that we think would work really well. Now let's see if we can make it work with all those other planning. What rules will you write for planning instead of having planning write the rules first? What kind of density makes, what does that density look like? How can you determine the density by just kind of looking at the setback building and saying, this is what we're going to get? So we're trying to develop a model that gives us a physical model of it before we start writing all the rules and before we start talking to people and I think, and this is all work in progress. It's not finished. We haven't used up our grant money yet. And so it's still in progress, but I think it's a really important question to address. Thanks.
Did you want to address it at all, Councillor? Since you were called in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I think it's oftentimes the stress points between what an existing community wants and what's necessary for the larger planning conversation, which really revolves around people. I think that tension, oftentimes, there's a lot of value placed on what the existing community wants. And political actors are oftentimes at the other end of that stress test. City planning staff are also susceptible. Neighbors sometimes are refusing to speak up, and I've seen this a lot in communities with respect to one angry neighbor could actually set the agenda for everybody else, even if there's 1,000 people that reside together. And so being able to evaluate a proposal, the merit of an idea that actually is detached from that is critically important. And it's not necessarily about taking politicians out of the equation, because I don't think that's going to necessarily work in Ontario, not the way it's set up anyways. But it's about making sure that those who are not at the table have a seat at the table. And what I really like about community-based planning is that it actually allows for the whole process to be way more accessible. And right now, community planning is not accessible. There's a secret language. You all have access to the lexicon. You are good. But for those who don't speak English, who have children who they cannot come out to those meetings, they are bringing a different set of values, a different set of lived experience, they are never going to get heard the way the process is set up now. So it's not even just a matter of thinking outside the box. I actually think we need to smash the box, because it doesn't work, and that's why we run into these really divisive conversations where everybody is so stuck, and nobody wants to be stuck. So. And that really is about resetting the conversation of who has access to power, and to actually, I would say, sometimes urban planning is very colonial. It's extremely patronizing when daddy knows best, and here's the big framework, and this is all the good thinking that's gone in there. And there's not a single word that speaks about human rights, housing, shelter, access to clean air or water. Like, there is a way for us to reinvent this, I'm sure.
And maybe my last question, and specific about Aura, since you brought it up. And I did write about it as this kind of like, when you're standing on Yonge Street, it is the thing you see now. It kind of almost obscured the CN Tower. And it was a bit of a troll to the original host of this panel, who was Alex Bezikovic, because he hates that building. And I kind of like the lights, and he hates them. But the other, and it's an architectural atrocity otherwise, except for the basement of Aura, which I find quite interesting, which is a little troubled right now. Yeah. But and I wonder about your perspective on that. If you go down underneath the big box, Bed Bath & Beyond and all that, in the basement, there's this warren of little shops. It's the kind of like mom and pop sized thing. And it reminds me sometimes going in there of going to other cities where you go inside a building, go down some steps, and there's this huge bustling bazaar. Our bazaar is not bustling. Does that space down there have any potential to be a kind of beacon of commercial life on Yonge Street as everything's changing?
I would say it does. I think right now the challenge is that Toronto is very uncomfortable about going up and down stairs. Despite the fact that we're an incredibly inaccessible city, it is so oriented for those who are able-bodied. If you happen to be 30 years old and 20 years old, this city's for you. But I do find that we don't have a mindset that we go to find other places, other retail and other spaces. I'm from Asia originally, and born in Hong Kong, and you will be amazed on where they can put a little shop. In every little nook and cranny, whether it's 3 or 4 or sometimes like 5, 6 stories up, people are literally, getting into these spaces to go to that very unique retailer. We don't have that here in this sense of downtown Toronto, and I think that city planning has also, they've also read the market. And what developers will often tell you, and it's not backed by anything because no one ever really looks at it from a data point of view, is that this is not what the market will bear. So the market will say that they want contiguous floor plate, and I heard your comments, Robert, about trying to make sure that it's deep, not just in terms of width. But we're kind of stuck in this sort of urban vocabulary that we can't get unstuck from, and I do think that part of it is just the fact that we're just not accustomed to. Innovation, access sometimes take place in nimble places. When you're forced to go to those spaces, you will go. And if there's a great little shop that has the amazing service, you will go. But when you're competing against Bed Bath & Beyond, and you're trying to get into the basement of the Aura, the big lights in big city tends to dwarf small independent retail shops. But the way to go around that, I think, is just over a period of time, smaller spaces, which is not the trend today. The trend today is bigger and bigger spaces. Smaller spaces will give us a diversity of retail options you want, and people will start to go find them because you'll have to go to multiple places to get their service.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you to the panelists. We're out of time. The future is kind of bright, I think.